titled Take Back Tech to Abolish ICE, and we're going to specifically be looking at the relationship between tech companies and ICE. And so before we kind of get into the meat of what this workshop is going to be about, I'm going to invite everyone to just do a round of intros, and I'll start. So I'll ask folks to share their names and pronouns. So my name's Catalina. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from Oakland, California. And what brought me here today is I have been working with Mijente on the No Tech for ICE campaign for about a year, though the campaign started in 2018. And so I am just one of the many, many people who have been involved in this work. And so I'm just here to kind of share a little bit about my experience on the campaign and to kind of provide some context for the work and why we took on the specific campaign of No Tech for ICE. So folks can go ahead and just drop their names, pronouns, where they're calling from, and also what brought them here today. I would love to just kind of read and see where folks are calling in from, what you're looking for from this workshop, so I can also make sure to address any of that. I realize I can't see the chat if I'm sharing my screen, so I'm going to stop sharing so I can actually see what folks are saying. So thank you to folks who kind of dropped stuff in the chat. And if you're just joining, go ahead and share name, pronouns, where you're calling from, and sort of what's bringing you to this conversation, just because it'll help me sort of figure out what to talk about, because I want to make sure that you all leave with the answers to some of the questions you might already be thinking about. So thank you so much, everyone, for kind of dropping in. Cool. Awesome. Oh, I see a lot of folks are part of the California immigration semester. That's cool. Okay, great. Awesome. So I'm going to go back to screen share. And let's.
And Catalina, if at any point you want me to kind of read out from the chat or do that piece of it, so
that would be awesome. I think
yeah, just let me know.
Questions. Yeah, thank
Great.
you so much. So yeah, I want to give a little bit of context to what Mijente is. I know Frankie did a great job kind of introing, but I want to again just like uplift Mijente. So Mijente was founded with an understanding that yes, it is true that demographics in this country are changing, that 1 in 5 folks living in this country are Latinx, but we also understand that demographics aren't destiny, and that we as Latinx folks can take an active role in sort of shaping the future that we're building together. And so we are an organizing home for Latinx people who are pro-Black, pro-Indigena, pro-worker, pro-mujer, pro-lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, pro-migrant, pro-earth. If you are Latinx, Chicanx, if any of that resonates with you, definitely feel free to visit mijente.net and check us out. We are a national group that's got smaller circles in different cities around the country, but also kind of this larger digital platform in which folks can connect with each other. And here's just like a little bit of some of the work that we're doing right now. There's the Fuera Trump campaign. Right now, Mijente is organizing Latinx folks to drive to Arizona and to Florida to talk to our gente, to talk to our people, to tell them to come out and vote. We've done defund the police courses to let folks know what are things we can do in our local communities to be a part of the defund the police movement. Local members have started mutual aid projects during the pandemic. And also the thing that we're all here to talk a little bit more about, Mijente has sort of launched the No Tech for ICE campaign as well. So if any of that is of interest to you, or you just want to learn more, definitely visit mijente.net. And you can become a member, or you can just like follow up on some of the cool stuff that's happening there. So yeah, so I'm going to talk a lot of history before we actually get to this current moment here. And I'm going to start by understanding the longstanding relationship between policing and tech in the United States. And we at Mijente understand that policing in the US is rooted in slavery, and that violence and surveillance have always been used throughout history to maintain white supremacy. So when we talk about tech and ICE, it can kind of feel like RoboCop, like we are in a new era that's like very overwhelming. But by understanding the history that's come before, we can just recognize that this is just the next chapter in a book that's sort of been going for a while. And that for me can sometimes be overwhelming, but it also gives me a lot of hope because I can also understand the ways in which people have organized and responded to policing in the past. So I'm going to go give us a very, very brief timeline of policing in the United States. A lot of this folks may be familiar with, but there's a couple things that I want to highlight when we think about the history of policing, the history of law enforcement, specifically in the United States. First, the way in which race has always been central to the evolution of policing. And secondly, to start thinking about how surveillance has also always been a part of the way that policing has developed. So in very obvious ways, policing in the United States is tied to race, as we understand that policing came out of slave patrols that were established in the 1700s. And we can even see the similarities here of the ways in which a runaway slave patrol badge looks very similar to how deputy sheriff or police badges look today, right? And so there's lots of concrete ways that we can see the connection between the oppression of enslaved Black folks in this country and policing. And there's also ways in which race was codified into law when it comes to policing. And an example is in 1703, there was the first curfew laws established in Boston that explicitly gave curfews to Black and Indigenous folks in Boston as a way to sort of suppress rebellions that may have been happening. The idea being like, if we keep force folks into their homes off the street, they can't come together to organize and rise up. And so we've already begun seeing two things here at play, right? First, the ways in which like race is integral to the development of policing and how we think about policing. And secondly, how surveillance is already a part of this, right? Because we have to enforce a curfew law, there is surveillance, right? Folks need to walk around to see who is out and about, to identify folks, to kind of enforce this law. And I think there's also other types of older technologies that were used to sort of push the surveillance of Black and Indigenous people in this country. So I think about slave passes as an example for that. So if you were a Black person and you were an enslaved Black person, specifically leaving your plantation, you needed to have a slave pass, right? Which we can kind of think as a form of surveillance technology, right? This was a piece of paper that had to sort of be your permission slip to leave, to be out and about, to kind of excuse your existence in a space that wasn't the plantation that you were working from. And so when we start to think about surveillance in those ways, I think it pulls back the idea that surveillance is just like cameras or things that we think about as tech, and understanding that there's always been ways in which the technology of the day have been used to sort of surveil, to watch, and to oppress people of color in the United States, especially when it comes to policing. And the other thing that I want to highlight is that there's always been evolutions, responses to changes from uprisings and also from law enforcement. So let me talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. So the 1924 Immigration Act is hugely instrumental in us being able to understand the ways in which race has also been codified into how we approach immigration. So it explicitly bans non-white immigration, and also created agencies like Border Patrol that would use violence that we were already seeing in policing to respond to the migration of non-white people. And so again, we're seeing the ways in which race violence, surveillance are kind of always intertwined with the continued evolution of law enforcement, whether that's policing or border patrol. The other thing I want to point out is that we've also seen policing, law enforcement constantly evolve. It's never truly sort of been abolished, been reformed. And what I mean by that is when I think about previously, with slave patrols, this was a response to slavery as a way to kind of control the bodies of enslaved people. And then post-Civil War, during the Reconstruction time, we see the creation of Jim Crow laws, which allow a new framework for law enforcement agencies to continue the surveillance, the oppression of non-white people. Then we see the civil rights movement. And so again, a lot of those Jim Crow laws are being overturned. But the response then isn't like freedom, equality, everything's great. That's not what happens, right? We see the creation of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, right? So there's another way in which we're building a new framework of laws that are targeted specifically to people of color. And we see the rise of, say, mass incarceration. So every time that there is a pivot in history, there is a shift, the response from law enforcement is to evolve, is to change. It's not like, okay, let's do something totally different that actually creates a world in which all people can thrive and be safe and be well. That's not the response. It's always like, how can we pivot things, create new rules, change the game to continue the oppression that we know has roots to slavery in this country. And so because we have that understanding, it sort of helps us in this moment to identify the patterns and cycles that we're seeing today. So if folks want to kind of take a second, and I can bring us back to the timeline if that's helpful, to just reflect on what are some of the patterns, some of the cycles that we see on this timeline in the relationship between law enforcement and the maintaining of white supremacy in the United States. And so this can be stuff that you see in the timeline, stuff you know from your own reading, but I'm just curious to hear from folks, what patterns, what cycles do we see throughout this history? And I'll kind of go back to the two timelines and give folks a second to respond in the chat. And Frankie, if there's responses that you want to read out, feel free. Again, what are the patterns? What are the cycles that we're continuing to see with the relationship between law enforcement and people of color, law enforcement and maintaining white supremacy?
I can share out incapacitation of Black and Brown people, slave passes, parentheses requiring a paper pass, curfews, like a stay at home and away from others. And that was echoing what I was thinking about too, even thinking with the most recent uprisings and the curfews and how those laws more covertly enforce the same kind of power dynamics.
Thank you folks for sharing, and feel free to keep dropping things in the chat. But yeah, like I said at the start, like learning this history, and this was like super abridged. There are people who spend their whole life really unpacking this. Y'all are, so those of you who are students are taking classes about this, like, you know that there's a lot going on, and I just gave you the Spark Notes version. But my purpose with doing that is because again, like learning this history helps us understand that this moment when we are dealing with this next iteration of policing, this next iteration of immigration law enforcement agencies, this is not unique, right? And also there are those who've come before us for generations who have been facing great odds, arguably greater odds than the odds that we're faced today, and they fought back. And by understanding that, for me, it helps me kind of position myself as just a small part in this very, very long struggle for freedom, and also to feel empowered that there is something I too can do to organize for change. So in this moment, especially when we think about the conversations that we hear right now, especially at the height of the uprisings this summer, every single corporation was putting out BLM statements. Everyone wanted to hop on the train of like, yes, like we love this racial justice. Just don't, don't come for our jobs, don't come for our money, but like we'll put out a statement, right? So there was sort of this shift in that we've seen in the media landscape that is entirely because of the organizing of folks on the grounds for years to sort of push back on the ways in which we think about policing and explicitly name the ways in which race is a factor and the ways in which the system is targeting non-white people, Black and brown people in this country. And so again, we're starting to hear the conversations of like, okay, so what do we do to make this different? How do we change this? And our history teaches us that if we are not with it, there will just be the next chapter that will continue the same oppressive mechanisms that have come before. And so at Mijente, we believe that tech is positioning itself as this race neutral alternative to our very unjust and racially biased criminal justice system. But the reality is that it's just a new lucrative tool that allows police to continue with the historic patterns of surveillance and violence towards communities of color. So that history teaches us, okay, there's a shift happening. We can all see it. And this is a moment to push for something that is truly transformational or to just put a Band-Aid on it. And we don't like the tech Band-Aid, and we'll talk more about why that is. But I think the first thing that's important is to name that specifically, that there is a lot of money in law enforcement contracts for tech companies. This is very lucrative for them. They're going to want to push for this. And we're trying to be very clear about what the playing field here is and what the stakes are for our communities. So curious to hear from you all, what tech tools do we see today being used by police and the justice system in the streets, in courtrooms, in jails, in prisons? Kind of curious to see what tech folks are already familiar with.
We have sharing out in the chat cameras, tasers, ankle bracelets, surveillance, Twitter.
Yep.
I know some folks were on the call last week. We were talking about Prop 25 and some of those algorithms, facial recognition, walkie-talkies. Awesome. Yeah, risk assessments in Prop 25, radios.
All right, y'all are some experts already, which is awesome. And so I have here a little table that breaks down some of the things that you folks have raised up. I think that algorithm, especially with Prop 25, is really interesting because again, it's sort of framing itself as like, well, this is better, right? This algorithm is better. And our history, our organizing tells us not actually, right? This isn't the justice that we're looking for. I have a whole bunch of things listed here. If folks have a specific question of like, oh, what is this? Like, feel free to drop it in the chat and I can define it. But one thing too that I've been thinking a lot about recently is biometric data. So biometric data, our DNA, anything regarding our physical being, how that is being collected by ICE. From migrants without their consent, automated license plate readers. They're just sitting around in cities, taking pictures of driver's license, and it's kind of a passive thing, right? It's not, you don't necessarily need someone standing there like looking at license plates, but it's still a part of the system. It still feeds into the continued targeting and arrest of folks in our community, right? So Frankie, I don't know if anyone dropped any questions about the specific tech listed. We don't need to go into the details, but if folks feel good, I'm going to keep going. So even though tech companies are arguing, hey, we have the solution, mass incarceration, that's not great. We've got some solutions over here. And they, even though they're sort of having that conversation, they're trying to position themselves in that way. There are a lot of ways in which all these technologies that you all have listed are incredibly harmful to our communities. And so I'm curious to hear from folks if you have specific examples of ways in which the technologies that you all have listed actually cause harm. To make it concrete, because again, it can feel very passive, but the violence is concrete. So I'm curious to hear if folks have examples from their own experiences, from things that they've seen on the media online, of how this technology is actively harmful to our communities.
So one more had come in before that I think kind of ties to this. Online monitoring law enforcement and gang databases. So again, thinking about collection. And then another one, surveillance measures seek to re-incarcerate individuals. Another comment, lack of privacy, which is important for undocumented people.
Yep, all of those are right on point. I think also there's another wild example of the LAPD's gang database, when they actually combed through, there were the ways in which like race is coded into algorithms. There were children as young as 5 years old being, identified within the algorithm as having gang affiliation simply because of their zip code and their name, right? And so there's ways in which like someone might feel like, oh, well, this is very passive, it's just an algorithm, but there's violence that's happening there. And it's perpetuating the cycle of who is targeted by these systems, right? So now that we've sort of talked a little bit about law enforcement, that broader history, and how there's always this next chapter that's happening, I want to talk about big data and how it's helping to build ICE's invisible army. And immigration enforcement, as we saw in the timeline, it's really just an extension of the broader criminal justice system, right? White supremacy entirely drives immigration policy. Who gets to come in? What is your journey like? All of that is entirely influenced by race, along with other things, but race is definitely a factor. And so just as white supremacy is driving immigration policy, it also drives the carceral state, and tech is now turbocharging that. And before we can really unpack the relationships between ICE and tech, we kind of need to understand briefly the history of ICE. And I think it always blows my mind that, ICE is really not that old. We kind of see it as an institution that has been around forever, and it really has not. So before 9/11, 9/11 being this pivotal event in how we respond to immigration, before 9/11, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service was the U.S. Immigration Agency. That was how folks, that was how immigration was dealt with. But then 1 month after 9/11, we have the Department of Homeland Security being founded and completely transforming the ways in which immigration is understood, approached, and what immigration enforcement looks like. So DHS is important to understand because it oversees various parts of the immigration process, not just ICE. It does run ICE. And I always think this is so interesting. Its mission is to, quote, secure the nation from the many threats we face. So I think that language is really interesting, especially when we consider the fact that this is also the agency that's supposed to be addressing the natural migration of people, right? There's this framework of the constant threat of violence, right? And that the job of DHS, of the agencies under DHS, is to, quote, secure the nation from the many threats we face. And so in case folks aren't aware, these are just some of the agencies that fall under DHS, ICE, CBP being two that we had to spend a lot of time kind of pulling apart and looking at. So following 9/11, again, I'm going to invite folks to drop things into the chat. What messages was DHS communicating about immigration and securing the homeland for folks who can remember back then? Sort of think through, like, who became a target for racial profiling? What new terminology did we start to hear about immigrants? After 9/11, how were immigrants viewed? So you can take any, respond to any of these, but sort of think about post 9/11, creation of DHS. How are we responding to immigration in a different way? Or maybe a more enhanced way?
So we have Muslim and Middle Eastern discrimination as
Mm-hmm.
one of those changes.
Mm-hmm.
And the word terror.
Yep. We also hear the terminology illegal alien being used at just like as common language, which is, when we really think about it, a very bizarre term to reference another human being, right? But again, there's a lot about othering. There's a lot about kind of pushing against that happens not just in the structures that get established after 9/11, the institutions, but also the language that we use to talk about migration. And that again influences the way we think about it, the way we feel about it.
Someone else offered global war on terror. So this
Yep.
kind of
Yep. And this is definitely global, right? We're not just seeing this in the United States, we're seeing this across the world. There is a different response to migration. And it includes increased surveillance, increased penalty, increased enforcement. So the Department of Homeland Security has made immigration a threat to be managed. That is what immigration is under DHS. And under the current administration, ICE's mandate is to exponentially broaden and go after and deport the 12 million undocumented immigrants living in the US today. So ICE's mission is to deport 12 million people. But there are only 20,000 ICE agents. There's no way in which 20,000 ICE agents can deport 12 million people. So ICE has, just like we talked about previously with law enforcement evolving, ICE has also had to evolve in order to figure out how they can, at a growing scale, target, arrest, and deport more and more people. So I think we can kind of figure out how to approach this activity, but I don't know, Frankie, if it makes sense to break into smaller groups, or we should sort of chat through things together. What makes sense?
Yeah, I think we have enough folks on the call. We can do breakout rooms if that feels comfortable. We could do about, so maybe we can do, could we do the first 3 scenarios and around 3 people per room?
Perfect.
Okay.
I love that. So I'm going to take us off screen share, and so I'll just explain what's going to happen next. So in order for us to kind of understand how ICE has evolved, we're going to look at three different scenarios of ICE agents identifying folks for arrest and deportation. So Frankie's going to break us out into groups, and in groups, I've got a doc here. There are 4 scenarios. The way we can do this is your group number can coincide with the scenario that you're looking at. So if you're group 1, look at scenario 1. If you're group 2, look at scenario 2. And the question that you're trying to think through is just, how is ICE identifying people for arrest and deportation? So that when we come back together, we can name what was at play in each scenario and sort of put together a timeline of how ICE has evolved. Does that feel clear? Do you need to repeat anything, or does that sound good? Cool. So Frankie, I will leave you to split us up. We can do this in like 3-4 minutes. It'll be real quick.
And then Catalina, if you want to drop, oh, it's in the chat. Great. I'm also going to broadcast that out to everybody, so we'll get a little message in there.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay. And yeah, just let me know when you feel like it's time to come back, and I can.
Yeah, I'll just keep my eye on the clock. And if folks are having problems, can they still message us? I just want to make sure that they can access the link.
Yeah.
And okay, folks are in the doc. That's good.
Yeah, they should be able to reach us on the chat. I'm realizing the lights are not on in here and it's going to get dark, so I'm going to turn the lights.
Go ahead. can you also share the question of how is ICE identifying people for arrest and deportation? I'm assuming people remember, but in case, thanks. And then I think literally in 30 seconds, we can be like, bring everyone back.
Sorry, I realized I was muted before. I dropped that in the message, and you think like 1 more minute, 30 more seconds?
30 seconds. Yeah, I feel like they're really short scenarios. Everything's right there. So yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks.
They just got their prompt to rejoin.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you. Also, I just want to thank you for participating, because I know Zoom calls could be awkward. So I appreciate folks being like, no, let's do this. Let's drop stuff in the chat, do our breakout groups. I really appreciate it. So folks got a chance to read through these scenarios. They're all based on a little bit like Law and Order. Like none of these are explicitly real scenarios, but are pulled from experiences that folks have had and instances that we organizers at Mijente are familiar with. And so for the folks who were in group 1 who looked at the first scenario, can you share what was the tactic at play that ICE was using in order to identify folks for arrest and deportation? You can share out vocally or in the chat.
I can share vocally. Just the targeting of a place of employment in an immigrant neighborhood solely on racial profiling, as distinguished by the white customer who was not arrested, and then a blanket arrest of everyone else.
Yeah. And so that when ICE was first beginning, this is like a common tool that they were using in order to identify folks for arrest. Again, 20,000 agents, 12 million people. They're trying to figure out like what's going to get us the biggest impact. And then of course, what happens? The community starts organizing in response. The community starts pushing back. And now ICE and DHS are dealing with lawsuits because of racial profiling. And they're like, okay, this tactic is not as effective because we know there's always going to be pushback. There's going to be blowback. So what's something else that we can do? So for folks who had the second scenario, can you share out what was the tactic that was at play that ICE was using?
ICE would be randomly, not ICE, I guess the local state enforcement was randomly, like basically racially profiling folks and stopping them and finding a way to get them into like the carceral system, whether it's like jail or not, and then from then alerting ICE so that their like safety is at risk. And so like there was like a sharing of like resources and data there, and yeah.
That's exactly it. And so what scenario 2 is referencing is the 287G agreement, which basically ICE was like, okay, we got 20,000 agents. That's not enough. Who can we partner with? Oh, law enforcement, local law enforcement. So they put resources into training local police officers, local sheriffs as ICE agents so that they could enforce immigration law. And again, as they're starting to collect folks, put them into the ICE system, right? So again, the community is thinking, okay, they're doing something different now. we're going to start organizing to respond to this. So what are we going to do? We are going to start demanding that these local law enforcement agencies break these 287G agreements. And so little by little, we see organizing happening across the country where folks are putting pressure on their local elected officials, local police officers, sheriff's department to break these 287G agreements. And so as we're starting to see that separation, ICE is like, okay, we need another tactic now. So for folks who were in the third group, what is another tactic that ICE started to develop?
So my group talked about how like it was the scene about loitering. So like any sort of thing that can be seen as like a violation, as like a reason to stop someone, and also like as like getting them, because you're like accusing them of something, you can get their fingerprints, and then like because you have them in the system, it's easier to like I guess track them or like identify them again.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So there became this the Secure Communities Agreement, which basically allowed for the data sharing of from jails with ICE. So like you mentioned, if someone is picked up at their jail, they're fingerprinted, that information, that data can be shared with ICE so that ICE can identify folks who are currently in jail, who are undocumented, and as they're being released from jail, move them to deportation proceedings. And that piece, I think, also too is an example in which like ICE is starting to understand the ways in which data sharing and tech can be really useful for trying to sort of grow its infrastructure and grow its influence. So I know that, correct me if I'm wrong, but no group got scenario 4, correct? So if folks want to take a look with me here in the doc, it's the last page. Scenario 4 is based on this is a real case, a deportation case. A woman is arrested in a sting operation. Previously, she was driving and ICE agents ran her license plate using an automated license plate reader, and this data allowed them to identify her. But ICE agents now, before they move forward to arrest someone, they want to get at least 6 data points to secure and prove that this is the identity of the person they're trying to go after. So they've run the license plate, and now they're going to go through their online social media presence to collect more data points to figure out, okay, is this the person that we're looking for, targeting? Yes, okay. Now we have sort of a data profile of who this person is, and let's see if we can interact with her using social media. So folks will this has happened before, ICE agents will create a fake social media account, and in this scenario, this woman was selling cakes in like a little local Facebook page to other families, selling a cake, and so someone asked to purchase a cake, and she went to go meet this potential buyer, and that buyer ended up being an undercover ICE agent, right? And so here we're seeing layers to what's happening, right? It's not just the automatic license plate reader and the use of social media data points to really identify someone. It's also creating fake profiles to create a location in which someone is going to be alone, right? And make the arrest easier. So we're seeing now sort of this new wave of like how folks are being identified and targeted by ICE. And that's really where organizers at Mijente and at lots of other local immigrant rights groups across the country started asking the question of like, wait a second, how did they know where so-and-so was going to be after work? How did they know that this person lived at this particular address? How did they know that this person was going to like sell a piñata or sell a cake? Like, how are they getting this information? And so that's when organizers again realized, okay, ICE is doing something different. What is it? Oh, it's got to be some tech partnership. There's something going on with tech that's we don't understand. So let's see if we can start pulling that apart. So I'm going to share my screen and kind of get us back into things here. So ICE has continually made strategic partnerships, first with police. We saw that in the earlier scenarios, and now with tech companies in order to extend their reach. And so that's where the No Tech for ICE campaign was born. And so tech companies are enabling ICE's efforts to collect, store, and use data to target immigrant communities. One thing I want to say, preface, no one involved in the No Tech for ICE campaign is like a super tech wizard. That is not our area of expertise. So we've had to do a lot of research to really understand like what the heck even is data? Like we were asking very kind of basic questions to try and piece all of this together. And so Mijente's No Tech for ICE campaign started in 2018 as a way to kind of disrupt this alliance that was forming between tech and immigration enforcement. And it was also a strategy under the current administration to push a lever that we felt needed to be pushed and could be movable. We all know that the current administration is not movable on questions around immigration, right? So who are the other players at play that we can start poking at to start moving, and to also draw attention to this alarming issue of the ways in which tech companies are partnering with ICE and also other law enforcement agencies. So we've talked about the pattern that organizers were noticing every time ICE made a pivot, and it became important to understand what exactly was happening because ICE was able to identify exactly where people would be and when, and that was alarming. It wasn't just where people were working or a grocery store in a specific neighborhood. It was now just like, oh, at this alleyway, like it was very targeted. And so the first step in this whole process was just research. Okay, we need to understand what's going on because there is no like tech whiz in this room who can like figure all of this out. So let's begin researching and collecting information about ICE's operations. Let's FOIA, let's demand to make public these contracts that they have with tech companies and begin to understand what are the tech tools that are being designed for ICE and being deployed by agents to help in their goal of deporting as many people as possible, right? And so what became very, very clear is that tech companies are making money, not just with ICE, but also with local police officers across the country. Going back to the previous conversation we were having earlier of how we are in the next stage of how law enforcement is trying to evolve. And so it is an opportunity, right? Because there is change happening, but it's also a moment to really organize, to get folks informed, to get folks involved so that we can push that change, that transformation to something that's more liberatory instead of just recycling the systems and patterns we've seen before. So there's also a lot of challenges with raising awareness around the role of tech and its expansion. Why would folks think there might be some challenges in just like talking about this, raising awareness around the relationship between tech and law enforcement? And folks can drop things in the chat. One thing that might be helpful to think about is visibility in some of the earlier scenarios versus later on as we talk through different iterations of ICE's work. So what's complicating our ability to bring awareness around the role of tech in ICE?
So someone shared deals and contracts are formed privately out of the public eye. And then a little bit earlier, this was shared before, but I think is relevant here as well. In Santa Cruz County and city, they prohibited its police from cooperation with ICE. So ICE evolved its approach to be an alleged focus on fighting gang violence. So that kind of shape shifting to meet its needs.
Yep. Law enforcement, ICE, they're fickle. They can figure out new ways to evolve to maintain their power, to maintain the status quo. And I think with tech, it's specifically difficult, not only because, yes, these contracts are happening in private, but also data is not tangible for regular folks, right? It's not something that's easy to immediately understand. We understand the violence that's being inflicted. We understand the impact, but the specific structures that are at play, the specific power players that are making these decisions, it's a little bit more ambiguous. And so that's kind of what's complicated our initial ability to have conversations around this, and also how we've had to be really strategic about how we talk about this and how do we visibilize what is already felt within communities. So by uncovering information around the contracts that ICE was having with different tech companies, there was one company that became immediately apparent as mission critical by ICE agents. And I'm not sure if folks have been following the No Tech for ICE campaign, but does anyone know what that company is? The company that's, quote, mission critical to ICE? So that company is a company named Palantir. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the whole tech infrastructure of ICE and then specifically talk about Palantir. So one of the first steps, as I mentioned before, as organizers at Mijente and elsewhere were realizing that ICE was evolving again, was folks needed to ask questions and do research. So in 2018, Mijente released this report, Who's Behind ICE? And it breaks down all of the tech contracts and how and what are the technologies that are being given to ICE, designed for ICE, and what are they doing that is facilitating the targeting, arrest, and deportation of our communities. And so we had to kind of become little tech nerds, which is not something that any of us had a super expertise in. So we had to understand, okay, like what even is data? What is going on here? So there's sort of 4 pieces of this. We all create personal data all the time. When we're on social media, if our geo trackers are on our phones and we're traveling from point A to point B, our cell phone bills, like data is just information, right? There's so much information that we create just generally from living, having a license, having a driver's license, and then also new kinds of data that are being formed, like having a Facebook profile. And so all of this data is for the most part available for purchase, right? And so there's groups called data brokers who can buy data from, say, the telephone company. And so these data brokers are purchasing data that becomes available to agencies like ICE. And so the specific company that, so data brokers in general, it's a $200 billion industry, right? There's also, like, when we say this is lucrative, this is incredibly lucrative work. And LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters are, is one of the companies that does a lot of the data brokering, purchasing data, selling it to other tech groups that ICE can then access, right? So they're one of the key contracts that are at play here. So I think of it as like they're collecting all this information. And we know that like our personal data is also being used for digital ads, like Facebook. That's an $83 billion industry. And while not directly involved in the ways in which ICE is collecting our data and using tech to target folks, I think it's just another way to highlight how there's just so much money in data, right? Whether that's government contracts, law enforcement contracts, or just, you know, advertisements. So again, data brokers are collecting all of this data, but I sort of think of it as like they filled this library with a ton of books. But if I'm an ICE agent and I'm trying to find specific information about this individual, how do I go through all of this data? And so that's where we see the creation of data analytics companies. And data analytics is a $189 billion industry. It's a lot of money. And the specific company that does data analytics for ICE is called Palantir. So Palantir is what allows ICE agents to search through all of the data information that's out there, again, from our social media platforms, from our bills, from our health records, our license, driver's license, all of that. They help filter that information so that ICE agents can like search for data on a specific individual or a specific community. And so that's why they're mission critical for ICE, because otherwise it would just be a lot of information that no one could really comb through. But Palantir is specifically designing their tools. They get feedback from ICE to like make it better, to make their targeting of people more enhanced. And all of this, both the data analytics tools and and the data from data brokers is held in the cloud, right? Data storage. And so Amazon Web Services holds the contracts with ICE and with lots of other government agencies. They're the ones holding a lot of data that the government is accessing. Again, this is a $411 billion industry. Like, there's a lot of money at play, and Amazon is really kind of ruling supreme in its ability to offer data storage to agencies like ICE. So a lot happening there, but Palantir just became very clear as a really key piñata, we like to say, for like this whole fight. So we could have talked about Amazon, we could have talked about LexisNexis, but it just was so evident that Palantir was really what was allowing ICE to move at the rate that it was moving with using data to target and arrest people. Palantir has been involved in the Mississippi raids that happened last summer. Palantir's just, their technology is being used also in gang raids. As we mentioned earlier, the ways in which ICE is evolving to try and be like, oh, we're just, gang support. Like, oh, okay. So they're constantly evolving, and Palantir is playing a role in all of this and always taking feedback from ICE to make their tools stronger and better for ICE agents. And so the overall contract that Palantir has with ICE is $50 million, which is really not that much money when you think about how much money a company like Palantir has. So we felt like there's a movable point here of, yes, $50 million is not nothing, but for a tech company that's worth hundreds and hundreds of millions, it's really not that significant. So can we make the demand from Palantir to cancel their contract with ICE? And so the alliance between tech companies and the government is incredibly powerful, and there's no single community or group that can take it on alone. And so organizing across groups to build a movement called No Tech for ICE became really, really critical. So we think of No Tech for ICE as a broader movement to draw attention to the collaborations between tech and ICE. And that's part of a broader conversation around the relationships between tech and law enforcement across the board. And our specific target at Mijente was just Palantir. So because we recognize that it takes a lot of people to successfully move something like asking a corporation to cancel a contract with ICE, we needed lots of different stakeholders. So I want to ask you all, who might be some of the stakeholders in the No Tech for ICE campaign? So you can drop some ideas of who those communities, who those groups of people might be, and you can use these questions to sort of think through, like, well, first, the obvious, like, who's being impacted by this tech, by these contracts? Who's building this tech? Who's researching it? Who's investing in these companies? Who's recruited to work at these companies?
So in the chat, we have tech workers and Palantir customers, other government entities. I'm also thinking about that web graphic you shared and everyone else who was connected on there. So Amazon and all of those other tech companies as well.
Some other really important stakeholders we identified are college students. Tech companies really flourish on marketing themselves to the newest, brightest tech workers that are coming out of universities, right? And so these companies like Palantir will pay universities tens of thousands of dollars to come speak to students, try and recruit them, bring them onto their campuses, right? So there's another leverage point there. Academics who have conferences, who receive money from companies like Amazon, like Palantir, that's also a leverage point. And then broader community groups that are organizing in solidarity with immigrant rights groups, all of these, they're all part of the network that we sort of saw created when we kind of launched the call of like No Tech for ICE. And so there were lots of different strategies that were used to kind of take on this very oversized role of tech. First is just exposing their role in the criminal justice and immigration enforcement through research and through media. So that's why we had the Who's Behind ICE report, because we had to be like, okay, we can just shout in the room that like tech companies have contracts with ICE and that's bad. We need to actually have like the research to back this up so that we can go to reporters, go to academics, and help verify what we are seeing on the ground here, right? And so that was sort of the first step. And then also educating communities on how to protect themselves from this new form of criminalization, talking to folks about local policy changes they can make. This is not related to No Tech for ICE campaign, but for example, in San Francisco, they have a facial recognition ban. So that's something that's on a local level that has changed because of organizing and movement work that folks have done on the grounds. We can take direct action and confront the corporate actors, the CEOs of these companies, the folks who are signing on the dotted line for these contracts. We can organize tech workers at these companies, students, investors, academics to leverage their influence in Silicon Valley and target specific companies around their contracts and local policymakers to sort of begin making shifts. So again, lots of tools at play to try and help mobilize and organize these different stakeholders to push towards this goal of, specifically with Palantir, canceling the ICE contract, but also more broadly, just like opening up the conversation around the relationship tech has with law enforcement. So as we mentioned earlier, it can be a little hard to visualize the violence of tech and law enforcement contracts because it's happening at a quieter scale, right? It's happening at a more massive scale, but in a quieter way. And so we worked with lots of really creative artists to come up with ways to distinctly visualize like what we're trying to communicate. So in 2018, when the Who's Behind ICE report was launched, the next step was we went to Burning Man because Palantir has a huge tent there where employees go to have a good time. And we were like, okay, people are dying at concentration camps at the border. They're being placed there because of your technology. So if you all are going to have a good time about this, we're going to disrupt that. And we worked with an artist to create this 800-pound cage that we placed in front of their tent. And so there was this really viral image of this cage with the Burning Man kind of like glowing man in the background that just like kind of went all over the internet and sort of began connecting for folks in their minds. Oh, tech companies and ICE, there's a connection here, which again, in some circles was kind of common knowledge, but wasn't something that folks were sort of on a broad scale beginning to ask questions around. We also, as part of our allied groups of folks we were collaborating with, there were lots of groups like Close the Camps and other groups, Jewish groups that were supporting our work around immigrant justice, around closing the camps. And they created, we worked with another artist to create this fencing that was referential to concentration camps in Nazi Germany, but also the same concentration camps you're seeing at the border today. With this sentence that I know really ticked off the Palantir workers, and this is in front of their Palo Alto Palantir office. IBM sold tech to Nazis, Palantir sells tech to ICE, no tech for ICE. So our hope with this visual was to make clear to folks that there have always been technology companies who have collaborated with different entities that have done great harm because those contracts are lucrative. And when we look back at that history, we're like, how could this be possible? And yet we're seeing that same pattern again because folks are not immediately connecting the violence that is facilitated through these technologies with what's happening in this moment. And again, folks are having private boardroom meetings. Our folks who are being impacted, they're not a part of that conversation, right? So we wanted to like make visual that way in which history again was sort of cycling. So we organized lots of actions, both in Palo Alto and New York, where Palantir has their headquarters in Palo Alto and in New York. We worked with student groups, we worked with allied groups, we worked with all sorts of community members to just show up. And for in 2018, in the summer of 2019, there were at times like hundreds of people showing up at protests in front of these headquarters and talking to tech workers to begin agitating, to begin asking them, hey, like, are you in favor of this contract at work? Do you support this? Like, why don't you talk to your boss? Again, just constantly agitating to get folks to to start having conversations. We also petitioned academic and tech conferences to drop Palantir as a sponsor. We got Palantir, Palantir was dropped from multiple academic and tech conferences. And that, again, was just an attempt to start to shake things up for Palantir so that we would create enough noise that they would be pushed to recognize that the contract was harmful to themselves, even if they wouldn't initially move because they recognize the harm that's being done to immigrant communities, right? We also worked with college students to research contracts that their university had with Palantir and demand that the university cancel those contracts. That was successful on campuses like Brown and elsewhere. We also organized an international day of action with students in the UK and the US, using the No Tech for ICE rallying cry. Thousands of students signed a petition saying they would not work at the tech companies that have relationships with or contracts with ICE. So again, just putting pressure at multiple points on Palantir. And so now the most recent development is Palantir has actually now gone public, which means that they can buy and sell stock on Wall Street. So again, continuing to profit off of the surveillance of communities targeted by DHS, by ICE. And that was a really intensive time for us sort of on the organizing side, because we wanted to really draw attention again to their work with ICE and the ways in which their work enables human rights violations because their technology has been used in the separation of families. And so we worked with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, the Council of Institutional Investors, Amnesty International. These are a big kind of well-respected nonprofits groups that are that put out reports, that put out letters targeting Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, and Peter Thiel, a co-founder of Palantir, and asking them to asking investors to reconsider their investment into Palantir because of their contracts with ICE. We worked with AOC to file an investigative letter into Palantir's dealings. She also tweeted something out which we were really excited about. So there was just a lot of work being done, sort of I think of on the institutional scale, to just, write the letters, send the emails, kind of push the conversation in a certain sphere, and set us up for some of the on the ground organizing we were going to do right before Palantir went public. And one of the things that was really interesting to us is as part of the process of going public, Palantir filed something that's called an S1, which just breaks down a lot of their financial workings and revealed a lot of new information to us. And one of the things that they talked about is as a warning to investors that they have contracts that could be, quote, perceived to be harmful. And so that was really interesting because they did not explicitly say our ICE contract or anything like that, but it was very clear that our years of organizing were beginning to force this company that's worth, again, hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion, to think about this contract as a liability. And if the company's thinking about it as a liability, investors, now that the company's on Wall Street, might also begin to think of Palantir as a liability because they have these contracts that help facilitate human rights violations, right? And so on the ground level, that can feel a little bit removed. But when I think about what CEOs consider, what wealthy investors consider, these are the types of things that they're thinking about, right? And this has always been a corporate campaign. We were always we had to play the corporate game, right? So my favorite thing that happened right before Palantir went public is we had a week of action. Some were digital. We got get hundreds of folks tweeting like defund Palantir, and then some were also in person. So Palantir's no longer has headquarters in Palo Alto because they said that the environment there was incredibly stifling. I think it's probably because we had hundreds of people show up to their office for weeks on end protesting. And so they moved to Colorado. the great thing about Colorado is there is a vibrant immigrants' rights community there. So we had a going away party for Palantir. This is the week before they went public, a going away party for Palantir in Palo Alto, which you can see here with the Raging Grannies, one of our allied groups. Good riddance, Palantir. We had like a whole little goodbye party. And then the next day when they opened their headquarters in Denver, Colorado, there were like easily 100 people who showed up to do another protest. They even had like a Palantir piñata, and it was like a whole thing. And so again, like it's showing that no matter where Palantir is going, like their work enables human rights violations. It is harmful, it is violent, and there will always be people calling that out. And then right before it officially went public, this was the end of September, we worked with another artist group in New York City to put together a play that that really highlighted Palantir's long history with both military contracts and other law enforcement contracts that have sort of facilitated immense violence. And so we did this whole performance with like paper mache drones, instruments, and a timeline to really, again, just make clear to folks like this is what's been going on with Palantir, and this is part of a long trend of work that they do that is harmful to our communities. And so all of that I see is like it was just like a lot of fun to kind of just like mess around and bring folks together and make clear that people on the ground are not in support of this type of work. So Palantir is now public. Have they canceled the ICE contract? No, but we don't see this battle as over yet. There are still multiple ways in which we are continuing to push them to sort of cancel the ICE contract, especially now that they're public. They are in a different way more accountable to folks. But at the end of the day, the purpose of the campaign is just to do things like this, to have conversations with folks and to draw attention to the collaboration between tech and law enforcement agencies. And because we understand the history that's come before, we know that this is a long road, and this is months, years and years of organizing that will eventually cause shifts to build a different future, build a more transformational future for folks. And so we really know and believe that building people power is how we win. And that means involving as many folks as possible in this movement and bringing awareness to this as much as possible. So I have here two scenarios that I want folks to kind of think through, because I think these two scenarios are what's happening right now with regards to the relationship between tech companies and law enforcement. And thinking about all the examples I've just mentioned, if you were in some way, if scenario A was happening in your hometown or scenario B was happening in your hometown, what might be something that you do? Do you, if you are artistically inclined, what is the artistic, the artwork that you would create to visualize, this collaboration between tech and law enforcement? If you are a student, like what kind of a campus organizing might you do? If you are an academic, like what sort of research or what petitions might you push, things like that. So I'm going to give folks just a few minutes. You can pick scenario A or scenario B, read through and just think for yourself, okay, if this was happening right now, what would I do? And it can be as simple as like, I would send out a tweet. And all of this is important because it's all building the movement. So I'll stop talking and folks can read the scenarios and sort of think, what would I offer in this space? Frankie, I don't know if you're still available to read off the chat, but if not, I can stop screen sharing so that it's easier.
No, I absolutely am. So we have some coming in. Go to local civil liberties and civil rights organizations like the NAACP and ACLU to get them involved. Send city council members data about the disparate impacts of this technology on low-income communities of color. Something I was thinking about in scenario A, I remember when Facebook made it possible to, it was like you could download all of the data they had collected on you and see it as a file. So I'm thinking about that it could be impactful to kind of almost have a visual map or some collection of all of the kinds of data that ICE might have been tracking about that person and sharing that out in some way.
My background, my biggest role in the campaign has sort of been around media. And so when I think about scenario B, the fact that local organizations have received donations from this company, like what if they return that check, right? If they, sent out a letter that was like, we decry the work that Ventura is doing, that's something that media would, draw attention to, that would sort of hurt the image of these companies, right? So there's the tactics that tarnish the image, which impacts the company. And then there's tactics that sort of build pressure in other ways. So I want to kind of go through some ways in which folks can take action right now. And so I'm going to share here. You're just going to follow me and we're going to visit the No Tech for ICE site. Are folks able to see it? I want to make sure it's not just the, cool. All right. So there's a couple ways in which folks can take action right now. The first is, if you scroll down on No Tech for ICE, you're going to see a series of toolkits. So we have a student organizing toolkit. If you're a student, there are ways in which you can organize on your campus to draw attention to the relationship between tech and law enforcement by looking at what are the contracts that my university has with any of these tech companies. Who hosts my university's data? Is it Amazon Web Service? Those are kinds of questions, research questions that Mijente is always happy to help folks. Like we can do the digging, we can look into that can help folks on the ground as students sort of do some organizing. There's also this policy toolkit that is really helpful if you're trying to look at what are local solutions we can push for. And I have a success story of a group that organized in Austin that was looking at the ways in which license plate readers were being used. And during the summer with the energy that was at play around defunding the police, folks in Austin were able to work with local officials to cancel contracts that the police department had that were inflating their police budget with tech companies, one of them being around license plate readers. So there's times in which this policy toolkit is just like a starting point to help folks start to think about what are some of the local policy changes that can happen in my own community that can sort of bring about change and start to disrupt the trends that we're seeing between tech and law enforcement. And then the second thing, the second thing I wanted to draw folks' attention to, and I'll share this link in the chat in a second, is if you click on join the movement, there's a place here where you can send a message right now directly to tech companies like Palantir, like Amazon, around their telling them sort of, hey, we're facing a pandemic right now, right? Like being at an ICE detention center is always deadly, but it's particularly deadly now. And so your contracts are again continuing, to facilitate this violence. And so it will kind of populate an email that you can send to folks. And so this will also put you in a kind of contact with, or put you onto the Mijente list so that when we have developments in the campaign, or if you just want to reach out and be like, hey, can I have help with this research question I have around such and such tech company in my own hometown, like we can help connect you and do that research. So I'm going to drop this link and folks can visit and just click where it says send a message to add your name. And you can scroll down and you'll see there's a place for you to just add your name. And it'll send the personalized message to tech companies that have contracts that we've revealed in the Who's Behind ICE report. And if that is not something you want to actively do, totally understand. There's also other places on the site for you to sign different petitions. If you are an academic, if you are a student, there's lots of different petitions that are at play. And if you want to add your name to any of those, you can. And then also if you want to just join Mijente or sign up for information around No Tech for ICE, but not send any messages to tech companies, there's like places for you to do that too. So I'll let folks kind of play around with those resources. Go ahead and consider sending an email out to tech companies with contracts with ICE. And also just kind of pause. And if folks want to ask questions, verbally, drop them in the chat, whatever, I'd be happy to answer questions. I don't have all the answers, but I know lots of folks who have lots of answers who can help. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Thanks, everyone.
And we will also be sharing these links out with you all in a follow-up email to this workshop, just so you have this all in writing outside of our Zoom chat. I'm going to drop some of the other links I shared at the top of the call as well, so you can stay connected. And I just also wanted to add in here, this is for our mailing list. So not just for this workshop series, but more generally, you can learn about upcoming events at Oxy Arts, including this Thursday, we have a really exciting artist talk with Dred Scott, who's going to be sharing about his practice and touching on, some of these same themes about the history of policing, surveillance, and violence in the US. Catalina, are there any other links or anything you'd like to share out in the chat while we're here?
No, I think that No Tech for ICE. And then if folks are interested in joining Mijente, I can drop that. It's mijente.net.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Catalina. This was so incredible, so much information. And like I said, we'll share all these links over email so you can continue to stay connected. But yeah, thank you so much. And
thank you all.
If anyone has any questions, again, feel free to drop them in the chat or share them here.
Yes, please don't hesitate if folks want help with anything or just want to follow up. You can always feel free to reach out, and I can even drop my my email here.
All right, I think we're going to close out unless anyone has any questions, but thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Catalina, that was so awesome.
Good. I was like,